Buenos días. Bueno, pues a nombre del Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas y de la División de Historia, pues les damos la bienvenida a esta conferencia magistral que nos impartirá la doctora Linda Colley, que es profesora de la Universidad de Princeton. Para nosotros es un verdadero honor recibirla, aunque sea por estos medios virtuales esta mañana, porque se trata pues de una de las grandes historiadoras de los últimos 30 años. Linda Colley es especialista particularmente en temas de historia imperial, historia global, historia británica, y en los últimos años también particularmente, digamos, en el contexto de las grandes discusiones constitucionales en la Gran Bretaña sobre el Brexit, etcétera, también ha producido varias obras importantísimas sobre historia constitucional. Y uno de sus últimos libros, del cual pues, nos va a hablar justo esta mañana, tiene que ver con estos orígenes globales del constitucionalismo. Se trata pues, de una obra sumamente original, interesante, que creo que se debe conocer no solo en México, sino en el mundo de habla hispana. Y bueno, también pues, nos acompañarán como comentaristas el doctor Víctor Cázares de la Universidad de Newcastle y pues nuestra querida profesora y secretaria académica, la doctora Catherine Andrews, a quien de hecho pues le reconozco el mérito de haber organizado pues este evento tan importante para nuestra división. Entonces, bueno, pues sin más preámbulo, le voy a dar la palabra a Catherine, quien a partir de este momento pues llevará la conducción del evento. Muchísimas gracias, Catherine. Bienvenida, doctora Linda Colley, y bienvenido, Víctor.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Voy a dar inicio al evento y vamos a estar hablando en inglés. Para las preguntas o dudas que ustedes tengan para poner en el chat para hacer a la doctora Colley, siéntense libres de poner los comentarios en español y yo ahí los voy traduciendo, ¿no? Pero a partir de ahorita voy a hablar inglés porque la doctora Colley nos va a impartir su conferencia en este idioma. Entonces, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all this morning with Dr. Linda Colley, who's joining us from the United Kingdom. Dr. Colley is a professor at Princeton University and a great expert in both British and global history. I'm just going to mention two books that she's written in the last few years, just to give an idea of her curriculum. One would be Britain's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, which was published in 1992. And if you are of the generations of students who have studied with me, they will have read some of the chapters of this book. Another great favourite of mine is the Ordeal of Elizabeth March, A Woman in World History. For my students of the history of feminism may have also read parts of this text. So it's a very great honour for me today to present Professor Colley, and she's going to talk to us about her new book that she's published this year, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, and I've forgotten exactly the way this, because I'm so nervous, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions and the Making of the Modern World. And so without further ado, I'm going to give the microphone to Dr. Colley, and when she finishes, me and Victor are going to ask some questions to open the floor for you who are watching at home to make your questions in the chat. Please, the floor is yours, Dr. Colley.
Thank you very much, Kath. Hello, everybody. It's a very great pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very grateful to all those who organized this show. And what I'm going to do in my comments is just focus on some main themes, which we can expand and discuss, I hope, in later questions and answers. My recent book, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, is essentially about spread. The book explores how and why from the mid-18th century written constitutions which set out the distribution of power and rights and were increasingly mass-produced and circulated by way of print, how these documents increasingly proliferated across land and maritime boundaries, so that already by 1914 they existed in parts of every continent. After the First World War, and even more after the Second World War, the rate of spread of constitutions of this sort only quickened even further, so that now in the early 21st century, there are only 3 states left on the globe, including my own country of birth, the United Kingdom, that lack something resembling a single codified constitution with the status of a fundamental law. So how did that happen? Well, because the gun, the ship, and the pen is a work of global history, it differs in some respects in the way it argues from other studies of constitutions. Most studies of this kind of political technology still focus very much on the experiences and the pasts of a single nation or region, occasionally in a very celebratory fashion. Books about constitutions are often very patriotic. This book, however, examines these phenomena, constitutions, across time, very much through transnational and transregional lenses. And it does so for 2 main reasons. First, advocates and writers of constitutions have always in practice borrowed ideas and provisions and strategies from other countries. Looking at these devices through a wide-angled lens allows one to identify and track these borrowings over time, and also to explore the movement of political ideas across geographical space, which was something I very much wanted to do. Second, I chose this particular writing strategy because I wanted in this book to get away from staging a kind of beauty pageant, if you like, of political constitutions. I wanted to avoid an approach that concentrated on identifying what was the best constitution at particular points in time. To my mind, such a beauty contest approach is always a historical, because these instruments, written constitutions, have in practice served multiple functions, so their success and importance cannot usefully be assessed by adopting a single criterion. Let me give you some examples of the diversity of success that constitutions can have. Now, historians of the United States, as you probably know, often celebrate the longevity of the American Constitution drafted at Philadelphia in 1787. And sometimes they contrast this durability with, say, the rapid turnover of many South American constitutions in the 19th century. But this is only one way of looking at things. As South American historians are increasingly arguing, the very quick-fire production of constitutions in some parts of South America in the 19th century actually works to speed up the rate of democracy, at least among males, and not just white males. So yes, constant new constitutions can cause instability, but in parts of South America and elsewhere, recurrent constitutions can also hype up, improve some levels of political change. Then again, even a short-lived constitution can, in practice, have a durable impact on public memory. The Tunisian Constitution of 1861, for instance, only lasted until 1864. But looked at in global terms, this Tunisian constitution is still important, still needs close attention, because it was the first constitution of a modern kind produced in an Islamic state. And it arguably has an impact as such even now. If you look at Tunisia today, for instance, it's arguable that the fact that Tunisia had a rather happier experience of the so-called Arab Spring than some other parts of the Middle East and North Africa is partly due to this very strong memory, folk memory almost, of having produced the first Islamic constitution, written Islamic constitution, however briefly, in 1861. And here's a final example of how constitutions in the past, and perhaps now, can succeed in different ways, that we can't just assess them by the same criteria. The history of these texts, written constitutions, is often looked at teleologically in terms of, well, how far did they advance democracy? But there are other stories. Even undemocratic constitutions can have wide international consequences. I think of the Japanese Constitution of 1889. It was very undemocratic, deliberately so. It enfranchised only a tiny portion of the male population. It focused heavily on the power and the status of the Japanese emperor. But because this constitution lasted in Japan, it acquired global importance. It was the first successful constitution in East Asia. Moreover, many nationalists in the eastern part of the world, in the Ottoman Empire, in India, in China, saw this Japanese constitution of 1889 as very important. It proved to them that the East could do constitutions and not just the West. And so the Japanese constitution, even though it's undemocratic, has enormous global significance in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, in tracking the global spread of these kind of political constitutions, I begin not with the American Revolution in 1776, which is often done, but rather in the mid-1750s, with the writing of a radical constitution in the small Mediterranean island of Corsica by an army officer called Pasquale Paoli. And I did this because for me, the main, most recurrent, though not the only trigger of the spread of these constitutions was the fast expanding rise in the money and manpower costs, scale, incidence, and geographical range of warfare that was occurring by the mid-18th century and continued after. Why and how did this shift in the quality of warfare, which becomes ever more apparent after 1750 roughly, help to trigger and shape the making of new constitutions? I suggest multiple reasons in the book. Let me just mention some. First, to meet the strains of expanding warfare in terms of taxes and troops, rulers of states, as the German political scientist Max Weber noted, increasingly felt the need to issue new contracts with their populations, specifically their male populations, making new concessions on paper. Increasingly, deals were struck by rulers and governors of states. We will extend the franchise, extend other legal rights in return for male conscription in warfare, for extra taxes, etc., etc. And you can see this over and over again, and it becomes more and more explicit after 1850. Then again, and as you in Mexico know very well, constitutions have frequently been the result of warfare, leading to the emergence of new independent states. It was in part the strain of involvement in long-term war and the invasion by Napoleon in 1807 that terminally weakened Iberian Spain and enabled its South American colonies, like Mexico, to rebel and create their own states and their own new constitutions. And you see this happening later on too. Indian nationalism, interest in independence goes back to the 19th century. But it really takes first the First World War and then even more the Second World War to weaken British imperial control in India, to enable Indian autonomy and the creation after 1947 of a very important Indian constitution, a massive document. Third, the experience of military defeat could also lead to states creating new constitutions as a kind of compensatory gesture, or having them imposed on them by the victor power. Thus, after the Second World War, France, which has been invaded and occupied, creates a new constitution to replenish itself, while Japan and Germany have constitutions imposed on them by the victor powers, the United States and Britain especially. In addition, fears of aggression from without can spark new constitutions. Not just war, but the prospect of war can make people write a new form of government. And I talk about that in relation to Norway in 1814. Norway's 1814 constitution, the second oldest in the world after that of America. And it's written in 1814 when Norway fears invasion by Sweden. Very rightly so, because it does get invaded. And so very, very quickly, Norwegian lawmakers start writing and crafting this document to ensure that some kind of identity is preserved, even if they're going to be invaded. One more point I'll mention, which we can talk about much more later. The degree to which the proliferation of new written constitutions was so closely bound up with recurrent outbreaks of warfare helped to explain why, even by the First World War, the vast majority of these instruments, written constitutions, exclude women from active citizenship. Men are needed for war, women are, it is then often assumed, not needed for war. So you don't have to write down their citizenship. And this was very much Bolivar's viewpoint. Bolivar, deeply interested in all kinds of constitutional creativity. But as he says, women can be patriots, but they cannot be the same kind of patriots as men. Basically, as far as he's concerned, they cannot fight. They cannot be full citizens. They don't have to be catered to in written constitutions in the same way. In writing The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, as I did, I also wanted to push against the notion that constitutional history is mainly to do with the actions of lawyers and bureaucrats. Hence, I pay close attention to some of the individuals, most of them necessarily men, who were involved in different countries and continents in writing these political texts, and who, especially before 1914, were often not lawyers, not bureaucrats, but came from diverse backgrounds. Very many of these actors were predictably military men, given the close relation between constitutions and war. Moreover, before 1900 especially, many of those most involved in constitution writing were also involved in other forms of writing as well. I think it's a shame that the history of constitutions and constitution writing tends to be compartmentalized and looked at in isolation from other forms of literature and communication. As I say, many constitutionalists were also interested in the written and printed word more broadly. Ito Hirobumi, for instance, the main author of the Japanese Constitution of 1889, writes poetry. And there are all sorts of links, I think, between the spread of constitutions and changes in print culture. And in some ways, I think, links between the spread of constitution and the developments of other new literary forms, such as the novel. Historians of literature, literary scholars really need to look at these texts, I think, not just political scientists and historians. So in this book, I deliberately take a multifaceted approach to these extraordinary and very important documents. I'm not interested, however, in this book in advancing an overwhelmingly attractive and benign interpretation of constitutions. At all times, constitutions have been concerned with asserting and firming up power, and not just with restricting the exercise of power. And very often, the kind of power that these instruments have catered to has been of a racialized nature as well as a gendered nature. One of the things we could discuss and think about is how written constitutions, almost by definition, prejudice those peoples lacking a written language. One of the ways of marginalizing people without written languages, if you like. And even when they did possess written languages and even access to print, indigenous peoples might still be, and often were in the past, excluded in law and on paper from the full bounty of constitutions. when, for example, the leaders of the Cherokee peoples of Georgia in the United States, peoples who did have access to print and who did have a written language, when these indigenous people drafted and published their own political constitution in 1827, setting out the boundaries of their territory in the hope that this would keep white settlers out, this document was promptly disallowed by the rulers of the state of Georgia and by many white politicians and jurists in Washington. Let me conclude, however, what has necessarily been a very rapid overview by making 2 points. First, although this particular Native American initiative, the Cherokee Constitution of 1827, was defeated, that it happened at all only serves to underline the volatility and the progressive spread of written constitutional texts. Once available in writing and in print, able to be translated, to cross frontiers, and to be ransacked for ideas by different interest groups and peoples, written constitutions were always dynamic devices. People could and did read them in different ways and derive fresh ideas and strategies from them. Leading on from this, while I seek in this book to reappraise our understanding of constitutions by viewing them across time, across national borders, and across oceans and continents, and by linking their evolution and spread with forms of violence, this is not in any way to negate the significance of this kind of political technology. Written constitutions are and have been very important and have done some good work as well as some bad work. Indeed, and I leave you with these thoughts, something we need to ponder now, it seems to me, when on the one hand, populist and authoritarian regimes are on the rise in some regions, and on the other hand, the written and printed word is fast giving way to digital technology and to the screen. One thing we have to consider, surely, is just how this vital political, legal, and educative device, a written constitution, is to be reimagined and retooled so as to remain relevant and hopefully beneficial in the future. Thanks very much.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. I was saying thank you very much to Professor Colley. It was, and I was saying that I was going to give the microphone or the camera to Dr. Víctor Cázares, one of our colleagues also from the UK at the moment. He's in a postdoc in Newcastle University, and so here you are.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Linda, for this wonderful talk and introduction to your book. And actually, I think that you are one of the very few people who are doing kind of restoring the reputation of constitutional history. So I guess your book is actually helping to make constitutional history great again. And it is really, for me, an amazing traveling guide for constitution lovers, and then you can really visit incredible places, incredible characters and ideas, and you can really see how, as you mentioned, constitutions change depending on the time or place. And I guess in showing all these different origins, functions, and even different consequences that constitutions have, your book is really like a good medicine against the idealization of law as something that mainly deals with abstract justice, rather than seeing constitutions like technological tools that record, adjust, and also channel different kind of struggles and interests. And it really outlines a richer landscape of the power of constitutions and also its lure across continents and cultures. And for me, what was really interesting is how you somehow break the link between democracy and constitutionalism. There is no really specific relationship about between two. And you were talking about how constitutions became very popular. But for me, I was thinking about this, that today it seems that the popularity of constitution comes from another source. Now, as you mentioned at the end of the book, like this driving force that created somehow this link or this social contract between the male citizens and the governments that are wars are vanishing. So now it seems that citizens have less power to negotiate. And nowadays it seems that there is a much more romantic vision of constitutions in which you can only have rights, and taxes and wars had been somehow eliminated from that equation. And so my question is then if the driving force of constitutionalism was at some point wars, what is the future of constitutions in a world that it seems to have less wars?
Shall I answer that now?
Please.
Well, thank you very much for those very shrewd remarks. And I absolutely take your point about warfare. Now, of course, and as David Armitage has shown in his survey of what civil war is and its significance in history, warfare hasn't stopped, but the bulk of wars in most countries since the Second World War have been civil wars. Now, those civil wars have often led to new constitutions being adopted. But what we haven't had, fortunately, are these vast international wars that occurred repeatedly. The 7 Years' War in the mid-18th century, the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, the First World War, the Second World War. Fortunately, we haven't had any more wars like that. And anyway, even if we had, the results, as you say, would have been different. We would have been obliterated. The kind of high-tech war that is fought now does not depend on conscription. You don't need to mobilize massive amounts of manpower as you used to in the past. So the idea that, political scientists have often talked about that states make war, war makes states, and remakes states through constitutions. civil war perhaps in some areas, particularly the Middle East and Africa, but elsewhere, I think that kind of formula has gone. So as you suggest, this is part of the other changes I mentioned at the end. I mean, the coming of a digital world, when we're not thinking in terms of paper and writing and print, all these things that constitutions once depended on. That's another massive change. So if we think these devices are of value, and I do, then how do we revitalize them and keep them current for the 21st century? This, I partly wanted to raise that question, but I also wanted, and I'm glad you think that that was what the book was about. I also wanted to revitalize constitutional history, which was once a very important topic. But really, since the 1950s, 1960s, has tended to be seen as rather dull and arid, unless you're a lawyer or a constitutional theorist. And I wanted to wake the subject up.
Well, I guess, yeah, in that regard, you succeeded pretty well. And I just had a final question that is a bit related with Mexico. I guess there is something that maybe is missing as well today. The faith on the power of law to shape society. It seems that, at least in Mexico, there is less faith that a constitution can change something. In the book, you talk about armies of legislators, that somehow great generals, they have to be good at certain sort of warfare techniques, but they also need to be good at writing constitutions and writing law, because from that is an aspect of warfare that is very important in the 19th century. And sometimes, I mean, this destructive potential of wars somehow opens up the roads for progressive reform. But I guess in Mexico, we had experienced a painful war against cartels for a long time without any constitutional change. And I mean, we had recently a new constitution in Mexico City, and this is a constitution that deals mainly with rights. It doesn't talk about taxes, troops, or how we're going to handle the main problem in Mexico. Somehow, I think that for me, citizens and politicians still had lost faith that constitutions can help them to change or challenge or to channel the resources of society towards something important to stop the war. And so I was really, it's kind of the same question, like still wonder to what extent wars still matter when it comes to constitutional transformations. Because, for instance, you have the war in Afghanistan, and this war didn't change not only anything in Afghanistan, but also it didn't promote any change in the United States, as, for instance, the Vietnam War did, no? And then also at the end of the book, you are mentioning perhaps wars are not super relevant, but maybe there is another kind of emergency will do the work. And I was wondering, what about COVID-19 or climate change? Perhaps that are things that might trigger a new kind of like constitutional reforms, no?
Well, I mean, it has been shown that if you look at constitutions that have been created in some regions of the world in the past 30 years, you can see the proportion of environmental legislation increasing. And so that's perhaps one way in which you might get people thinking that the law could still help by helping them survive through environmental changes, though, of course, environmental laws are not necessarily popular. But looking at the kind of laws that are prioritized, and I think also another way in which faith in constitutions can be maintained. You see examples of that in the Republic of Ireland. And what has happened in Ireland in the past 2 decades is that the power of the Catholic Church has been rolled back. There's been more emphasis in constitutional change on women's rights in regard to matters like abortion. That doesn't please everybody, of course, but you see constitutions there being used to signal that the new Ireland, the new Republic of Ireland, is now a secular state, that the Catholic Church no longer has the same kind of power over the Republic that it once did. And obviously a minority of people don't like that, but a majority of men and women in Ireland do like that. So here's an example where constitutions are still able to be perceived to be useful. But it is difficult, and it's partly difficult, I think, too. Something we haven't talked about is that people are now rightly so much less deferential than they used to be. And the idea that you can have a group of leaders getting together in a building, writing a document and then saying, here you are, everybody, this is the new system. People don't want that kind of, way of organizing. So what kind of machinery do you use to write a constitution now? It's become much more complicated with the decline of deference and with the growth of democracy.
Thank you, Linda. Catherine?
Microphone. Well, I would just like to start by saying I'm one of these boring constitutional historians who've always been excited by written word and boring.
Congratulations.
But I share your desire to make constitutional history great again. Although I have to say that I was very much amused by your the reference to the beauty contrast approach to constitutional history, which is is also one of my bugbears. The idea of constitutional history is to show why my constitution in my country is better than everybody else's. I think that has been one of the characteristics of constitutional history, at least in the Western world. And in Latin America, above all, because we have a kind of schizophrenic problem, or that's not a good way of putting it at all, a problem of wanting to be and not being at the same time Western. There's also the discussion always about whether constitutional ideas are native to Mexico or to Central America or South America, or whether we just copy and who we copied. No, did we copy the United States? Did we copy Spain? Were we overly influenced by the French? Why are our constitutions inferior to everybody else's constitutions? What have we done that? Why can we not achieve through our constitutions the stability which the United States had through its own constitution? And one of the ways to answer that question really is because the United States is pretty much on its own as being a constitution that's lasted for so long, but we compare ourselves to these kinds of to the United States, and we wonder why we are not like that. So it's on the one hand, it's the beauty contextual approach, and on the other hand, it's the inferiority complex approach. I also thought that one of the things that was very interesting and challenging about your book would be the way of looking at, in one of the traditional ways of looking at constitutions and constitution writings, is the idea that a constitution is the act of the well, in liberal thought and in popular thought of the moment in the 19th century when Mexicans are writing their constitutions, the idea that constitution writing is the act of the creation of nation. That this is the moment in which, when we produce our constitution, our nation is born. Whereas the Mexican history, Latin American history in general, and I would say European history in general, what it shows is that the constitution writing process is, in fact, a list of wishes and desires which then have to be implemented. And I think your book, what it shows us is quite how the political technology of a constitution is one of many technologies used by state builders to create nations and to make nations out of geographical spaces and communities, and to use the idea of a constitution to impose conformity. So it's not that the nation pre-exists or brings into being a constitution, but rather the constitution imposes a nation and a nationality on the area which it governs. And I think that's a really very interesting perspective on the whole idea of constitutional history when looked at from a constitutional theorist or history of ideas perspective, no? And so I wanted to ask you, one of the things you said in the talk was how written constitutions prejudice those who lack written law. You talked to us also about the example of the Cherokee Nation's attempt to write a constitution to defend itself against white settlers in the United States. And I wondered whether also we could use the same argument looking from a Mexican or a Latin American's perspective, in which that the paradoxical nature of constitutionalism that comes to us from Cádiz, which in your book you talk about as one of the influential constitutions of the 19th century, it paradoxically, the Cádiz constitution appears to adopt a much more inclusive perspective on citizenship than perhaps that of the United States, in the case that it accepts the peoples born whose ethnic roots are in America and Spain as part of the Spanish nation, something that will be then adopted by all Latin American constitutions, and equally does open the door to the offer that opens the door to people who are from whose ethnicity is from Africa, which could also have access to citizenship. In Mexico, for example, this is very much the case. The Cortes de Cádiz, the constitution writing body in 1812, have to publish a special decree for Latin America in which they allow explicitly African Latin Americans to vote in those places in which there's not enough of white ethnicity or mestizo ethnicity or indigenous ethnicity for them to hold the elections. And so there is a more inclusive citizenship. But the paradox is that constitution writers, what they aim to do is limit in as much as they can precisely the participation of these groups, indigenous and Afro-Latin Americans and other brown-colored peoples, from the exercise to voting, with requisites, with requirements that what they want to do is force these people to stop being different and to assimilate themselves and to become the same, to become mestizo or to become white Latin Americans or white Mexicans, and then they can participate. So they put barriers in the way of participation in this respect. And I wondered if that would be a valid, in your opinion, would be a valid comparison to what you're seeing, for example, the example of the Cherokee Nation. And before I let you speak again, I want to ask you, really, because of the thing that most, there's two things that I'd really like you to talk a bit more about for the benefit of the people at home or in their offices or wherever they're listening to us. You have a very interesting part of your book in which you talk about the impact of the Plan de Iguala, which is from General Iturbide, the plan of 1821, and you detail how it arrives in the United States in the spring and summer of 1821, and its references in Ireland and then in Calcutta. And I wondered if you could, for the benefit of the Mexican listeners, tell us a wee bit more about that, because I think they would be very much interested to hear quite how influential the Plan of Iguala was out with the Mexican border.
Thank you, Kath, for those such a wealth of comments. So you'll have to prompt me if I forget some. But yes, this great plan of 1821. It's very interesting, I think, in all sorts of ways. But one of the ways that it interested me was that it showed how it's not just spread in this case, but it's also the matter of translation. How a constitutional document from one part of the world, if translated in another language and into a different geographical site, can be interpreted in so many ways. And even though this plan had specific and, you know, somewhat muddy political purposes in Mexico, once it got to Ireland in a translation into the English language, the Irish Catholics, who at that point were excluded from the right to vote by London, Irish Catholics activists started saying, look, here is an example of wonderful religious toleration. All groupings are being allowed to serve the state and have rights in it. Now, that wasn't necessarily accurate, but that's how, absolutely, but that's how in translation it was read and used and reprinted in some Irish newspapers. And in India, in Calcutta, which was already a great center for print in the 1810s, 1820s, the plan of 1821 is extracted, and what it's read as there by some Indian and white radicals who want a reformed British Empire, that this is a plan which shows how Indians, by which they mean Indians in the Indian subcontinent, could be admitted to political rights. And I mean, they're talking about men, of course, not women. And you would then have a reformed British Empire. So this is a very interesting document in its original form, but as it travels, it gets reinterpreted again and again and again, and that I found very fascinating. Your point about not just that Indigenous people may be explicitly excluded, but it might be more subtle than that. They may be coaxed into conformity by basically being told, if you behave like the white people do, then perhaps we will accept some of you. And that is certainly done. I mean, there's lots of basic brutal exclusion too, not least in the United States, which is often very explicit in the state constitutions about excluding not just blacks, but excluding Indigenous people and, of course, women. But sometimes it's more subtle than that. And you get documents that say, well, people who can acquire basic literacy in the dominant language and have an element of education, perhaps they can get the vote too in 15 years or so. So you do get the sense that these people are being, drawn into the state in return for sacrificing some of what they are. Yeah, absolutely. You raised other points too. Can you repeat what you'd like me to?
I was talking about nation building as an exercise in imposing nationalism, a sense of nationhood upon a community. I'm really talking from the Mexican perspective, because one of the great traumas of Mexican history is the war with the United States in 1847. And after the war, after we've lost half our national territory and the Mexico City has been invaded by the US troops, there is a general soul searching going on in the national elites about what happened, what went wrong. And one of the things they come to the conclusion is that Mexico wasn't able to defend itself because Mexico didn't have a sense of nationalism. No, people from Sonora or people from Sinaloa and people from Veracruz and people from Yucatan didn't rally round to help other people from different parts of what was considered to be Mexico. There is no nation. One of the we lost because we haven't got a nation. One of the people who are writing about this, his name's Maximiliano Otero. And so one of the great policies that's going to come out of this is precisely in the line that you were talking about as written educations as an educational tool. The idea that we have to inculcate or educate the nation to be a nation. And one of the tools for this education precisely is understanding the Constitution, understanding what it means to be a citizen. And so I wondered, in other parts of the world, I mean, I really concentrate on Latin America and above all in Mexico. I wondered in all the research you did in other parts of the world, if also the written Constitution is also as an educational tool, but also as identity document, which is used to educate people into how they should be.
Yeah. And I think I'd go further and say it's not just educative, it's not just identity. In some cases, it's also it's an invention that it's another aspect or can be of invented tradition. And one sees that again going back to Ireland with the treaty providing for an Irish Free State in the early 1920s and subsequently the Constitution, the first Constitution. And a lot of emphasis is on Gaelic. And in fact, when the Irish politicians who sign these documents add their signatures to them, and then those signatures get turned into print, the signatures are in Gaelic. They're not using Gaelic themselves. I mean, many of them can't speak Gaelic, but they want to stress Gaelic as the ancient Irish language that distinguishes it from Britain. And so there's a whole culture of the official national status of Gaelic. And you can see that in the constitutional documents. And it's substantially, as I say, an invention. Of course, there was Gaelic in Ireland, but it was a minority language, and most of the nationalists couldn't speak it or write it. But it had an enormous propaganda and public value in these texts. And the way I think that constitutions, when they are mass produced, serve as what you can do with print for the public and to invent identities and to push identities as well as ideas. It's really very interesting.
And I wondered also, the other fascinating thing about your book is the chapter on the Pitcairn Islanders. And I wondered, I've got two questions here, I think. One would be to do with precisely the power of written documents and the power of language, which in its original instance can be read to be very inclusive if you talk in terms of gender. Because in many languages, Spanish included, when you talk about Mexicanos in the plural, it's assumed to include women and men. And so it does beg the question, and suffragists in Mexico at the beginning of the 19th century will try and enforce the question that are women included into the idea of citizenship, just because it's Mexicano is not, in that case, shouldn't be understood as a gendered term. It happens in Mexico, it happens in France, it happens in other places, and the response is usually from in this case, the 1917 the Constitutional Congress, or in France in the different congresses that they have, is that no, actually, the use of the term that is usually we think of as neutral, actually it's gendered and we only include men, and so no, you can't vote, and no, you can't be voted for. But what we have with your chapter about the constitutions in Pitcairn is precisely that the women are included from the get-go, and then they try to exclude them once the Pitcairn Islanders move, and I can't remember where to, and they successfully defend the inclusion of citizenship. And so, as another aspect of the power of the written word as a manifestation of how government should be and who is included in those rights, what would the example of that chapter on Pitcairn, if you could tell us a wee bit more about it, and what would you think would be its value to your argument?
Well, Pitcairn, for listeners, if you don't know much about it, don't worry. Pitcairn is a tiny speck of rock in the South Pacific. It was the place, if you know the story, where the mutineers from the Bounty, the Royal Navy ship, ended up in the 1790s together with various women and some men they had picked up in Tahiti. And so this small community grows up clinging to the rock of Pitcairn. There's about 100 of them by the 1830s. They're mainly, by this stage, Tahitian. The whites die very quickly, and it's their mixed race progeny that shape this community. And for various reasons, and I won't go into the full story because it's very detailed. They get a written document in 1837, which comes to be regarded and called a constitution, and which continues to be active until the 1920s, when it's replaced by another constitution. But what this document says, and it's why it can stick, it doesn't just say persons, it says men and women, male and female. And that is very powerful because, as you say, when the Pitcairners run out of food on their island and they're shipped to another part of the British Empire in the Pacific, and the local officials say, oh, no, come on, you can't vote, you're women. They can say, oh, but look at this piece of paper. It says. And so they have to accept it. I mean, in some ways, it's a quirk, but I think indirectly it shows that because Pitcairn is so small, in a way, it doesn't matter. So they are allowed to do what they do in a way that large states don't allow. And of course, New Zealand too, where you get women voting very, very early. New Zealand is not small, but it's cut off. It's far away from lots of places. It isn't involved in big wars. It doesn't need conscription, not until the First World War. And therefore, there isn't this sense, oh, well, we must confine the vote to men, not just for cultural reasons, but because we need to extend special favors to men because they are going to be the fodder of our armies and defense systems. So I think I wanted to talk a bit in the book, and so I devoted really the bulk of a chapter to it, to the Pacific, which has very many interesting sites about constitution building, including among indigenous people, and not just in Pitcairn, in places like Hawaii also, and indeed Tahiti. And they're often left out of the story, and I wanted to bring them in.
And I think it's one of the best bits of the book, I have to say, because the introduction of the Pacific Islands and the constitution writing, also the part about Japan, in which you talk about you mentioned it a bit in your talk, and how influential the constitution of Japan is later in all over the world. In fact, Víctor mentions Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is it's when it has the part of its constitutional revolution at the beginning after the First World War. Precisely looking to the constitution of Japan for inspiration. And so it's interesting, isn't it, to think that how we've written constitutional history has tended to concentrate its blends on certain places to the exclusion of many others, and it doesn't help us understand the history as a transatlantic or transnational phenomenon.
Yes, and I mean, another type of diversity I wanted to include in the book was that it isn't just nations that experiment with constitutions, empires do too. And Japan, of course, was an empire. And also, and it's understandable, given the number of, the success of republicanism in the United States and in much of South America very early on, that constitutions are sometimes too easily equated with republicanism. And again, one of the things I wanted to show in the book was that how much constitutionalism takes off in different monarchies, how important this concept of a constitutional monarchy comes to be in the 19th century and after as a kind of compromise solution.
Certainly. I have one question from Dr. Mijangos here. I should invite the audience also to submit their questions, but perhaps they're a bit intimidated by the language barrier. Pablo asks, and it's a typical question, so I'm just going to smile and read it. About our dear country's constitutional history. So history countries, why is the United Kingdom, why has it never had a written constitution like perhaps the United States or the Latin American states? And do you think that there will be any possibility of this changing in the near future?
Yes, I mean, it's an obvious question, really. In fact, there was a kind of written constitution. It was created in the 1650s immediately after a period of very vicious civil war in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. It was created by the new Republican regime that was briefly set up and called the Instrument of Government. And it was intended as a kind of constitution. It listed forms of government. It included new rights like toleration for Jews. it disappears when the monarchy is restored in 1660. And thereafter, although there are various constitutional texts of importance produced in what becomes the United Kingdom, that's the end of constitutions of the written sort as far as the island of Great Britain is concerned. Will there be a written constitution in the future? I think it's possible. I mean, if Scotland secedes from the United Kingdom, which is certainly within the bounds of possibility, Scottish nationalist parties say they want a written constitution. So, you know, you might get Scotland getting a written constitution. It's possible with demographic change in Northern Ireland that you'll get Northern Ireland in the next 3 decades or so rejoining the Republic of Ireland, so that you'll get a united Ireland. If so, of course, you'll need a new Irish constitution to cover the whole of the island of Ireland. That would just leave England and Wales without a written constitution. And I would suspect that in that kind of shattering blow to the shape and the size and the complacency of the United Kingdom, there would be pressure in England and Wales, one would think, for them to join the written constitutional bandwagon. But who knows? But I think, you know, I think constitutional change in the next few decades for at least part of the UK is very possible.
I would agree. There was a proposal for a written constitution for Scotland during the last referendum. It was a very interesting proposal because it planned to constitutionalise the prerogatives of the Queen, the royal powers of prerogative, which seemed to be quite a interesting proposal from my point of view, because I would have thought that would be the most difficult thing to formalise within a written constitution, given that the powers of prerogative could be, under certain circumstances, so wide as to be difficult to put into, to limit into articles of the Constitution. I think that would be one of the big challenges. And in fact, it's one of the challenges that constitutional writers faced in the 18th and 19th century, in the sense that they tried to create systems from old systems and to make sense of the old system through the new. And it would be interesting to see how Britain would go about, or England in this sense, would go about facing this this challenge in the contemporary period. But that's not mine. We don't have any more questions. I don't know if Victor has anything else he'd like to say, or...
Yes, just finally one short comment. When I was reading the book, I was also exploring a much more like female constitutional writers in different times as well. And it seems that there is a recent study that argues that women are much better at writing constitutions. It's something very recent. It's a study like the last 20 years. And they argue that, I mean, what they mean by better is that they are actually more keen on having much more inclusive and democratic constitutions. So with much more, they really try to cover the entire population. And it seems that nowadays women, I mean, it's not only that they're like better, but also they are more into constitutional conventions and they are participating more and more. And I perhaps was wondering if that might change something. If can women save constitutionalism in the future now that they are more keen on writing and much more active in these kind of processes?
Well, I certainly think, I haven't read that particular book, but I certainly think you could look at some of the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, and what you see in those countries increasingly is not just women leaders of governments, but women becoming the dominant group of ministers in many administrations. Partly because, and this perhaps picks up what you say, it is argued that women are better at working coalition governments because, they can compromise and sort things out. They're more practical. I have to say it depends on the woman. I didn't notice Margaret Thatcher, say, being much given to compromise and getting on with other groups. But certainly I think that the way that a small country like Iceland, which is now dominated by women politicians, is exploring new ways, not just of constitution writing, but also of constitution thinking. How do you get representatives of the people together to discuss what kind of constitution they like? And Iceland, I mean, it's not always succeeded, but Iceland's been very creative in that respect. I think that it is often, or it can be, an advantage for constitutional creativity if you're small, and also in some ways if you're on the margins. You can be, perhaps because you're not so aware of great power competition and things like that, that while war can cause constitutions, and often did, a lot of the most creative places were often quite small, not particularly important, but their very smallness seemed to encourage, in some cases, creative thinking. Pitcairn Island is one example, Corsica's another example, Hawaii, indeed, which had a string of constitutions after 1840, which explored things like social policy. Again, a small set of islands, but very creative. And again, I think there's a bias, as you said, Kath, towards the same old constitutions, the same examples, the same big powers, the same movers and shakers. But if you expand your vision of, and are willing to accept the diversity of constitutions that have been produced over the centuries, you get, of course, a much more interesting and varied picture.
And I guess now that you mentioned about this, like, constitutional making on the margins, in this study, I guess the place they mentioned that they are having a much more creative thinking, and it's also related with war, is Syria. In Syria, women are more engaged in the peace process and also in trying to develop new laws. So perhaps because, but it's also related to the point. It's in the margins and also in the middle of the war.
Okay.
Well, if there are no more questions, I don't know if you'd like to add anything, Linda, before we conclude.
No, I think this has been really very exciting. I'm glad we finally made contact, even if it means that I'm talking from a rather strange part of my house, but never mind. But thank you for inviting me to this event. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Cass, for your great questions and comments, which I've been scribbling down and will think about in the future. And I hope at some point we actually get to meet for real.
Yes, I second that. It would be very nice. We'll try and invite you here to Mexico once the pandemic is no longer such a pressing problem.
Yeah, wouldn't that be good?
It'd be lovely. We'll try very hard to do this. So we're going to finish the transmission now. I'd like to thank everybody who've been watching us. The transmission will be available to watch as a recorded piece as well, if you weren't able to catch everything that was said. I'd like to thank Professor Linda Colley for joining us from her house in the United Kingdom, and we've had her moving around trying to get as near to the modem as physically possible, but I think we've managed to have a really good quality transmission. So I really thank you very much, Professor Colley, for your patience and for having persevered with us with our technical difficulties. And I'd like to thank Víctor also, Dr. Víctor Cázares, who has been instrumental in organising this event, and I want to thank him particularly for putting us into contact with Professor Colley, and I want to wish him all the best with his postdoc in Newcastle. And pues everybody else watching, pues les mando un gran saludo y espero verlos en otra ocasión a través de nuestras redes del CIDE. Hasta luego y buenas tardes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.